Good evening, weary traveler of thoughts. Tonight, let's gently wander together into a world of drafty stone corridors, fur-lined robes, and ceremonial breakfasts you're not entirely hungry for. Let your limbs go heavy. Allow the outside world to soften and fade. Dim your lights, hush your inner dialogue, and nestle deeper under your blanket. The royal chambers await, and they do not believe in hurrying. Let us begin. You awaken to the soft creak of old wood, followed by the faint pop of a torch sputtering against the wall. There is no alarm clock, no buzzing phone, just the sound of woolen curtains shifting slightly in the morning air, if it can be called morning. The sky is an undistinguished gray, and the torches still seem to do most of the work. A rooster crows, but as always, it is too early. Your bed, immense, uneven, and curiously damp at the corners, is a four-poster structure, its once grand canopy now gently draping a fine collection of dust and the occasional sleepy spider. You shift beneath layers of heavy blankets, some embroidered with symbols you don't recognize, others clearly repurposed tapestries from a time when warmth mattered more than prestige. You are warm. That is something. But not comfortable. The mattress dips slightly on one side, a result of royal generations before you choosing the same favored sleeping position. There's a slight ridge where your predecessor, possibly an aunt with very firm opinions on posture, preferred to sleep with a sword under her pillow. You don't know why you know that, but somehow you do. Across the room, a servant, his name might be Gregory or Gerald or Jeffrey, but you aren't yet invested enough to clarify enters without knocking. Privacy, after all, is not for monarchs. He clears his throat in the respectful but tired way of a man who has done this exact thing every morning since before you had the throne, and possibly before you had adult teeth. My lord, he says quietly, as though afraid your authority might be fragile before breakfast. The brazier has been stirred, and your slippers warmed. The weather is mild. The pigeons remain. The cook reports the porridge is, in her words, less burnt than yesterday. You nod with the noble air of someone pretending they were already awake. He doesn't believe you. You both agree to silently pretend otherwise. You swing your legs over the side of the bed and place your feet into velvet slippers that were meant to impress foreign ambassadors, but now mostly collect dust from under the bed and a little straw from the hallways. As you stand, your robe slips off a nearby hook with a sigh, like it knows today will be long and unremarkable. The room itself is more practical than you expected. A large stone fireplace does its best to warm the vast echoing chamber. Several tapestries hang along the walls, scenes of battles you do not remember, fighting gods you do not worship, and feasts you were certainly not invited to. The carpet, made of something resembling wool and optimism, is too small for the room, and curls upward at one corner, threatening to take down monarchs with weak ankles. You approach the wash basin, where lukewarm water sits in a chipped porcelain bowl. A maid bows as she leaves the room, having prepared it earlier, and accidentally whispers, "Sorry in your direction, though," for what neither of you is quite sure. The mirror above the basin is more decorative than useful. Your reflection is warped slightly, as if even it cannot quite commit to your royal image before coffee. You wash with slow, half-hearted motions, splashing water onto your face in the medieval version of self-care. There is no soap, only a vaguely herbal paste stored in a little ivory box. It smells like mint rosemary and something that could be moths. And then comes the robe, heavy, embroidered, lined with something that was probably fashionable last century. It takes effort to lift. You wrap it around your shoulders like a ceremonial yawn and shuffle toward the door. The hallway beyond the chamber is lined with portraits of ancestors, all frowning disapprovingly in the same direction. It is unclear what they're upset about. Perhaps your posture, perhaps your breathing, perhaps just the general state of your reign. You try not to take it personally. Their eyebrows were painted that way on purpose. As you walk, you consider the day ahead. Meetings, some form of stew, a message from the neighboring barony that will take 10 minutes to read and 30 to explain. You are expected to approve taxes, glance meaningfully at some maps, and nod encouragingly at a group of men who have memorized your schedule better than you ever will. If time permits, you may also be asked to pardon a goose thief or bless a child with an unfortunate haircut. All this, and you haven't even had porridge yet. And so you descend the stairs slowly, because stone is slippery in the mornings, and dignity bruises easily. You are followed by a faint echo of your own footsteps, which makes you feel briefly important, until you realize the echo is slightly faster than you are. At the bottom of the stairs, the main hall awaits. But that dear listener is a story for another moment. For now, the torches flicker softly. The slippers are warm. And you are, despite the robes and responsibilities, still rather cozy. Your crown, still missing, is not needed yet. You may rest a little longer. There's no rush in royalty. Not today. Not in this story. You make your way slowly down the grand staircase, each step accompanied by a faint creak and the distant rustle of tapestries that sway as though gossiping behind your back. The corridor widens, and the stone gives way to slightly less cold stone, a subtle architectural flourish that serves no purpose other than reminding you someone once decided the ground floor needed to feel fractionally more hospitable. Gregory. Yes, you've settled on that name, for now, waits at the bottom, standing with a towel folded in the precise manner of a man who has no other towel to fold today. He gives you a shallow nod, not quite a bow, just enough to remain within the rules of etiquette without needing to commit to formality before porridge. The great hall awaits, he murmurs, as if the great hall were a temperamental aunt rather than a cold expanse of table and echo. You nod back, equally non-committal, and follow him through a series of slightly damp archways, your robe dragging softly behind, like a noble yet reluctant parade. The hall itself is a cavernous room lined with long wooden tables, most of which remain empty at this hour, save for the far end where your breakfast sits on a pewter tray that has not been polished since your coronation. You approach the throne-like chair with the well-worn cushion, the one that sighs louder than you do when sat upon, and Gregory places the tray before you as if it were a sacred relic, and not a lukewarm bowl of lumpy oats, and a piece of bread resembling a small brick. The bread is yesterday's, or perhaps last week's. It is difficult to tell without tasting it, and frankly, you're not feeling adventurous. The porridge has formed a skin that you peel back gently, watching the steam rise with all the enthusiasm of a disinterested ghost. You stir it once for show, twice for hope, and then take a slow bite. It is neither warm nor cold, and the taste reminds you vaguely of boiled cloth, though you've never confirmed that with science. You chew politely, aware that someone, somewhere in the kitchens, is waiting to hear if it was to your liking. You will not give them the satisfaction. Across from you, a scribe lingers with a small ledger in hand, ready to note the day's affairs, or whether you finish your bread. He clears his throat and begins reading in the monotone of someone who has long since given up on dramatic flair. 3 petitions await your signature, he says. 1 regarding the repair of the mill bridge, which washed away again last week. 1 concerning the baker's dispute with the candle maker over property line soot. And 1 from a widow who would like to return her second husband to the cemetery from which she believes he never should have risen. You blink slowly. Gregory takes another step back. You nod for the scribe to continue. The bishop also sends word that he has received a troubling omen, the scribe adds. A goat refused to eat in the presence of a stained glass window depicting Saint Elfric. He believes this signals unrest, or bad weather, possibly both. You place your spoon down. This is, regrettably, not the first time a goat has influenced policy in your court. You motion for the ledger, and using the quill provided, begin signing your name with the delicate flourish of someone who hasn't yet had their second cup of weak ale. Your handwriting has not improved. It looks less regal than reluctant. The scribe takes back the pages with a bow that nearly sends his hat tumbling, and Gregory steps forward once more with your morning elixir, a steaming cup of something that wishes it were tea, but smells more like a boiled root that lost its will to live halfway through steeping. You sip. It's earthy, vaguely medicinal, and insists on being noticed. You do not ask what it is. The castle healer once told you it was fortifying, and you've chosen to interpret that as a compliment rather than a warning. As you sip, another servant approaches this one, bearing a small scroll sealed with wax, bearing the mark of the neighboring duchy. You recognize it instantly, the stylized hedgehog, rampant, clutching a sheaf of wheat with mild suspicion. You break the seal and unfurl the scroll, revealing a message written in excessive flourishes and unnecessary Latin. The Duchess, it seems, is still upset about the matter of the disputed turnip cart. You read through the layers of diplomatic frustration, allusions to ancient treaties, and a veiled reference to your grandfather's sense of smell. You sigh. This will require a reply, a vague one, possibly involving apologies that don't admit guilt and promises that don't include timelines. You tuck the scroll under your plate. It can wait. The porridge, against all odds, has cooled further. You finish it out of obligation, not desire, and let the spoon clink against the bowl with a sound that echoes far more than it deserves to. Gregory clears it away with the quiet resignation of a man who knows he'll be serving something identical tomorrow. The doors creak open again, and your steward enters, carrying a basket containing today's messages, minor grievances, and a single slipper returned by the castle laundress with a note that says only, "Was not me." You take the basket and begin sorting through its contents. Each parchment, a small window into someone else's mildly inconvenient life. A loose goat on the chapel roof. A cracked wine barrel. A knight who swears he saw a ghost near the pantry, but may have just seen his own reflection while tipsy. You file these under to be dealt with later, which is the closest thing to a royal protocol your court currently has. Outside, the morning light begins to peek through the stained glass in soft colors that make the dust in the air look almost intentional. The scribe coughs once, which is your signal that the council will soon assemble each member armed with scrolls, complaints, and their favorite chair, which they guard like dragons guarding mismatched cushions. The day presses on, gentle but unrelenting, and though the porridge has been eaten, the robe still clings to your shoulders, and the throne chair continues to poke one particular rib. You rise slowly. There is business to attend, kingdoms to maintain, and a mysterious stain on the map room carpet that someone will probably ask you about. You step toward the council chamber, your slippers scuffing softly on the stone, the torchlight flickering like half-forgotten ideas. The air is faintly scented with damp parchment and faintly less faint worry. Gregory follows at a respectful distance, already holding your second-best quill for signing documents of medium importance. The hallway narrows. Voices begin to gather at the far door, and just as your hand reaches for the iron handle is colder than expected, a subtle reminder that this castle has more draft than insulation, and that your authority doesn't extend to interior heating. The door groans as you push it open, not dramatically, just enough to suggest it disapproves of frequent use. Inside the council chamber is already buzzing with quiet tension, quill scratches, and the occasional, overly loud throat clearing. The table in the center is long, narrow, and stubbornly warped, curving ever so slightly toward one end, so that everyone seated there appears as mildly suspicious by default. Around it, your advisors are already in place. Lord Penthurst, Minister of Grain and Unsolicited Metaphors, is scribbling something intensely into his notebook, most likely a 3-paragraph simile about crop rotation. Beside him is Dame Illyry, who oversees the castle accounts, and is currently glaring at a parchment as if it owes her money personally. Further down sits Brother Cadwin, your spiritual advisor, who has taken to humming softly under his breath while flipping through a leather-bound book titled Signs, Omens, and Misbehaving Goats. You enter with the practiced nod of someone who is both mildly regal and recently fed, and they rise in a staggered chorus of scraping chairs and muttered formalities. You wave them back down, mostly because the chair you're about to sit in is not built for ceremony. It is the only one without arms slightly lower than the rest, and has a mystery creak that activates only when you shift your weight, and never at any other time. It was once covered in brocade, but now sports a cushion that sags like an old memory and smells faintly of aged ink and cautious despair. you sit. The creak arrives right on schedule. Let us begin, you say, which is the traditional phrase that means, please keep this brief, even though it never works. Penthurst is the first to speak, rolling out a scroll with dramatic flair, and immediately launching into a passionate account of mildew affecting the southern grain silos. He uses the words pallid spores and moist menace in the same sentence, which makes you regret not bringing a second cup of root tea. He recommends an emergency inspection, a new ventilation grate, and possibly a statue of Saint Barley to watch over the stores. You nod once, carefully, avoiding eye contact with Dame Ilary, who is already doing the math in her head and doesn't like it. She slides a small slip of parchment toward you. It reads, "No, Ilary." You pretend not to see it. Next is Brother Cadwin, who clears his throat and reads solemnly from his omen log. The pigeons have returned, he says, but only to the west tower. The east tower remains pigeonless. This asymmetry concerns me. You try to appear thoughtful while processing what response, if any, is appropriate for directional bird anxiety. Noted, you say, which is how you respond to most things you'd prefer not to address before lunch. Cadwin nods, as though you've offered divine insight. Then it's Ilary's turn. She skips niceties and opens with "We are broke." There is a pause as this news settles like a damp quilt over the chamber. Define broke, you say, cautiously. If we were a barrel of ale, she replies, we would be the sticky ring at the bottom. If we were a candle, we'd be the stub no one bothers to light. If we were a goose, I think I understand, you interrupt. What's the cause this time? Repairs? Mostly, she says, flipping through her pages. That roof patch on the west wing didn't hold. The stonemason says he can fix it properly if we give him more time and a third goat. He's very specific about the goat. The chapel windows need replacing after last month's incident, and we still haven't recovered the funds borrowed to host the annual Festival of Mild Triumphs. You nod again slowly. The Festival of Mild Triumphs, while beloved by the townsfolk for its lukewarm cider and underwhelming joust, had indeed cost more than anticipated, especially after the prize pig escaped during the closing ceremony and led a chase into the apothecary's garden. You make a mental note to rename it something with a less ambitious budget next year. Any suggestions, you ask? Ilary shrugs, which is her version of optimism. Raise tariffs on imported salt, levy a small fee on bread larger than a loaf, or perhaps just collect the taxes that were due last spring. Ah, you say those. Last spring had been muddy, politically and literally. collecting taxes had taken a back seat to dealing with an outbreak of sullen sheep, and a brief but intense dispute with the Beekeepers' Guild. You turn to Gregory, who is standing by the door, pretending to be invisible. Make a note. We'll gently remind the townsfolk about spring collections. Gregory nods without writing anything, which means he will remember exactly as much as he wants to. Penthurst clears his throat again, which signals a return to agricultural news. The barley harvest may be strong this year, he says, provided the mildew abates and the sun favors the northern fields. I suggest we perform a symbolic blessing. Nothing elaborate. A speech, some bread tossing, perhaps a brief moment of silence for last year's hail. Very well, you agree. Not because it will help, but because symbolic bread tossing tends to raise morale and lowers your chances of being publicly compared to a damp turnip. Cadwin leans in his voice, dropping to a more ominous tone. There have also been whispers in the village, rumors of a beast in the woods, large, shaggy, with glowing eyes. One shepherd says he lost 3 sheep. Another claims it speaks Latin. You wait a beat. The beast. Apparently. You rub your temples gently, partly in confusion, mostly in preparation. We'll have someone investigate, someone who does not easily confuse wind in the bushes with cursed wildlife. Sir Drenel Gregory offers helpfully. Sir Drenel is your most optimistic knight, and therefore the most suitable for unlikely missions involving potentially scholarly monsters. You nod. Yes. Send Drenel, and tell him to bring the good torch. The council murmurs in quiet agreement. Papers are gathered, and the room begins its slow shuffle toward adjournment. Chairs scrape, back scrolls are rolled, and Cadwin quietly hums a blessing that may or may not be a recipe. You rise your robe, catching slightly on the uneven floor, and make your way toward the hallway again, where the light seems somehow dimmer now, as though sensing the administrative nature of your next task. The hall beyond stretches ahead, lined with faded banners and a single mouse that pauses mid-scurry to observe your passage. You turn left toward the solar, where your midday tasks wait. A message from the Chancellor, a broken ceremonial goblet, and a meeting with the steward about this year's official portrait, which apparently must include a dog, though no one knows why. You walk slower now, your slippers softly brushing the floor, your fingers trailing along the cool stone wall as the flickering torchlight begins to fade behind you, and the scent of aged vellum and faint ink begins to grow stronger ahead, mingling with the subtle warmth of sunlight filtered through imperfect glass, reaching in lazy patterns across the dusty stone floor of the solar. It is one of the few rooms in the castle designed to feel mildly human, though the walls still insist on being unreasonably vertical, and the chairs seem built to remind you of your posture rather than support it. The solar, named not for its brightness, but for its occasional sunlight and marginally warmer air, serves as a semi-private space where you are meant to reflect, read correspondence, and occasionally feign thoughtfulness while someone paints your likeness. You cross the threshold with the cautious energy of someone both expected and already late, nodding at the steward, who is waiting beside a collection of rolled parchments, a few ink pots, and a small wooden box labeled "Paint Probably." His name is Sir Aldrich, though no one calls him that. Most simply refer to him as the steward, or the one who counts the spoons after feasts. He is a tall man, with the posture of a ladder and the expression of a tax ledger come to life. Your Grace. He begins bowing slightly. We must speak of the portrait. You resist the urge to sigh. The portrait has been a topic of quiet tension for several weeks now, ever since the royal painter declared that the current one no longer reflected your regal maturity and also had visible mildew damage around the eyes. You seat yourself in the chair that rocks slightly when not invited to, and wave Aldrich on. He suggests a more assertive pose. This time, the steward says, unfurling a parchment with a rough sketch. It shows you standing on a hill sword in hand, gazing nobly into the distance, with a cloak fluttering at a mathematically impossible angle. There is also discussion of including a hound at your side to symbolize loyalty. You tilt your head. Do we have a hound? No, Your Grace. But we may borrow one from the captain of the guard. His dog has been trained to sit majestically and only barks at musicians. You stare at the sketch, which has clearly been drawn by someone who has never seen your nose, or has made a very brave choice regarding it. The sword, you notice, is suspiciously large and appears to be labeled "not to scale." Do I have to hold the sword, you ask? The painter insists it represents strength and lineage. Aldrich replies, though he did mention you could rest it gently against a stone if your wrist begins to ache. And the hill symbolic, something about ruling from on high. We could also use a chair. You consider this. A chair sounds appealing. You are fond of chairs, even the ones that creak ominously when sat upon. Fine, you murmur, but no fluttering cloak. The last time I wore one, it got caught in the privy door. Aldrich makes a note on a scrap of parchment and tucks it into his sleeve with a precision that suggests he will forget it entirely by lunch. He moves on. There's also the matter of the broken goblet he says, retrieving a wrapped object from the corner table and gently unveiling it like a troubled artifact. The goblet is indeed broken, cleanly snapped at the stem, with the base still clinging to a smear of wax from the banquet table. It was last used by Lord Berwick, who claims it simply collapsed in his hand, though the cook suggests he attempted to stir gravy with it. You lift the top half. The metal is dented and slightly warm, as though insulted. Can it be repaired? Yes, but the smith insists on being paid in advance, ever since he fixed the bishop's incense holder and wasn't compensated. I thought the bishop paid in blessings. He did. The smith was not consoled. You place the broken goblet down and file it mentally into the category of items we shall pretend were ceremonial until further notice. Aldrich then presents you with the day's correspondence, a mix of neatly sealed scrolls, one ominously unsealed letter, smelling faintly of fish, and a single folded piece of linen embroidered with the words, "Please read before Tuesday." You begin with the most official-looking scroll, which turns out to be a congratulatory note from a neighboring barony on the birth of their 6th goose. Not gosling. Goose. They consider it a family member and have named it Edwin. The letter includes a drawing of Edwin, which is unsettlingly lifelike, and features the goose wearing a very small crown. You put it aside gently, unsure if you are meant to respond. The next letter, sealed with wax in the shape of an unfortunate turnip, is from the village alderman. It details a minor riot over cheese rations, sparked when one baker claimed her cheddar had been sabotaged by rival curd philosophy. There are at least 3 pages of accusation, a crude diagram of cheese wheels, and a note from the local constable confirming all suspects have been released on account of public boredom. The final message is verbal delivered moments later by a breathless page who arrives mid-scroll with hair like wind-blown straw and one boot missing. "Your Grace," he wheezes, "the bees have swarmed again." You blink. Again. Yes. And this time, they've occupied the east turret. You take a moment to consider the implications. That turret is mostly decorative and holds only unused chairs and a tapestry of your great-uncle sneezing near a bear. Still bees. Are they hostile? Ambitiously so, the page admits. They've constructed a rather large hive and appear to have claimed a banner pole as their throne. Aldrich sighs. "Should I fetch the beekeeper?" "He's already there," the page replies. "He's negotiating." You pinch the bridge of your nose, not in frustration, but in the quiet acceptance that monarchy is 90% bee-related at the worst moments. "Send backup," you say. A guard, a smoke, bellows, and possibly a second beekeeper, preferably one who isn't allergic this time. Aldrich nods and steps away to coordinate this latest development, leaving you alone with the sketch of your portrait, the broken goblet, and the faint, rhythmic buzz of insect conquest drifting through the open window. Outside, the sky remains indecisively gray, and you watch as a servant hurries across the courtyard, carrying what might be a goose or a particularly defiant pillow. In the distance, bells toll to mark midday, or perhaps just to startle the kitchen staff. You glance down at the embroidered note. Tuesday is still several days away, but you open it anyway. Inside, stitched in tiny thread, are the words, "There is something under the west stairs." It hums. You don't know who sent it. You don't know what it means. But you already know, and you already know, this is going to be one of those things no one wants to investigate. But everyone will talk about over soup. You stare at the stitched words again, their careful little loops dancing uneasily against the linen. There is something under the west stairs. It hums. Not rattles, not creaks, not scurries, like a mouse wearing soft shoes, but hums. And if there's one thing you've learned as a reluctant monarch with a penchant for putting off unpleasant chores until the last possible moment, it's that any noise described with musical ambiguity is best handled before it decides to escalate into a chorus. You tuck the linen into your sleeve and rise with a sigh, waving off a steward who attempts to hand you another scroll labeled urgent-ish. You step out of the solar and into the corridor with the same energy one might use to approach a mildly sentient wardrobe. The west stairs aren't particularly notable. They're not spiral or ceremonial. They are the plain functional set used by servants and junior advisors who prefer not to be seen in daylight until their second breakfast. The walls around them are damp more often than not, and there's a stubborn cobweb in the upper corner that no one bothers to remove, because the spider is rumored to be named Roger and considered more efficient than the steward's assistant. You reach the landing and pause. The corridor is empty, save for a lone broom that leans slightly against the wall, like it's tired of sweeping political intrigue. The stairwell stretches downward into the kind of dimness usually reserved for crypt's legal proceedings, and that one storage room with the cursed gravy boat. You descend slowly, each step producing a reluctant echo as your slippers whisper against stone. There is at first no humming, only the usual damp silence of a stairwell unused by people with titles. But then, just as your hand brushes the cold edge of the railing, there it is, faint, low, a sound somewhere, between a sigh and a choir that forgot its lines. It isn't loud, but it's persistent, not mechanical. Nothing in this castle qualifies as mechanical. Unless you count the catapult someone tried to repurpose into a laundry pulley, but rhythmic, as though the stones themselves are humming in their sleep. You reach the bottom and find the usual assortment of forgotten furniture, a barrel that smells like retired cabbage, and one small locked door that you vaguely recall being marked miscellaneous. The humming is coming from behind it. Of course it is. You try the handle. It turns, but the door doesn't open. Not stuck, not locked, just stubborn. You give it the royal shoulder, which accomplishes nothing but a faint thud and the distinct feeling that you've bruised your dignity. You step back, glare at the door, and then remember Gregory, who has reappeared silently at the top of the stairs, holding what appears to be a sandwich. "Is that the humming?" he asks. Voice barely above a whisper. You nod. He chews thoughtfully. "It's rather tuneful, isn't it?" "Open the door," you reply. "I'm not touching it again." Gregory, with the calm of a man who has opened more strange doors than friends, places his sandwich delicately on the banister and leans into the handle with a practiced nudge. The door creaks open. Inside, there is a room the size of a modest broom closet, lit by a single, inexplicably glowing jar placed atop a wooden crate. The jar hums, just sits there, humming, softly, comfortably, like a bee trapped in a dream. The glow is pale blue, like moonlight caught in a bottle, and it casts long shadows that feel entirely too artistic for a supply cupboard. You and Gregory stare at it for a long moment. "Should I poke it?" he asks. "No," you reply immediately. "Definitely not. Not until we've decided whether it's enchanted, cursed, or just aggressively decorative. Could be alchemical," Gregory suggests, "or left behind by the last alchemist, the one who tried to turn beetroot into gold and accidentally dissolved his sandals. He left his sandals on my desk, you recall, still slightly dissolved." Gregory nods in solidarity. "Would you like me to fetch someone?" You consider. The royal alchemist has not been seen since the incident with the onion that bit back. The court magician refuses to descend any staircases that smell of mildew. That leaves the healer who once diagnosed a mysterious rash as regret and prescribed long walks and less stew. Fetch the healer, you decide. Tell her it's glowing and humming and mildly judgmental, possibly. Gregory vanishes. The jar continues to hum. You stand there arms crossed, trying to determine whether the jar is vibrating or whether your imagination has finally decided to develop plot twists. You lean closer. The humming changes pitch ever so slightly, as if acknowledging your curiosity. You back up again. Very well, you mutter. You win this round. When the healer arrives, Morella, practical, sharp-eyed, and entirely unimpressed by supernatural phenomena, she pushes past you and peers into the room with the expression of someone trying to identify a root vegetable by smell alone. She says. You wait. Definitely magical, she adds. Or just unusually well fermented. Either way, I don't recommend licking it. No one was going to lick it, you insist, probably too quickly. Morella nods, reaches into her satchel, and pulls out a small scrap of cloth which she wraps around the jar and lifts without ceremony. The humming muffles slightly, but does not stop. I'll take it to the infirmary. If it explodes, it can do so where the bandages are. You nod in agreement. This seems wise, the kind of wisdom only years of treating bee stings, cursed wigs, and inexplicable sneezes can produce. She leaves with the jar tucked under her arm like a mildly dangerous cat. Gregory retrieves his sandwich. You climb the stairs slowly, pausing halfway to reflect on the fact that nothing in the past hour has resolved anything, but somehow now includes a glowing object. 3 witnesses, and likely a footnote in the castle's annual report. As you return to the upper floor, the scent of roasted, something greets you from the direction of the kitchens. Possibly chicken, possibly turnip again. The bells begin to ring faintly, not the timekeeping sort, but the smaller bell that usually means a visitor has arrived. A diplomatic sort of bell, courteous but urgent. You sigh. You are not dressed for diplomacy. You are not mentally prepared for foreign hats. And yet, your feet carry you forward down the corridor, past the broom, still leaning loyally against the wall, toward the front hall, where the steward now stands with a scroll in one hand and a concerned look that suggests either unexpected diplomacy or something involving livestock and paperwork. You approach cautiously, your robe catching slightly on a snag in the runner rug that's been tripping guests since the reign of your great-uncle Henry, who once fell on it so dramatically. The court debated for a week whether it was performance art. Aldrich, the steward, turns as you enter, his eyebrows gathering in the way they always do when a situation is about to involve heraldry or opinions. Your Grace, he begins, we have a delegation. You glance past him to the open hall doors, where a group of 4 figures now stands, each dressed in garments that suggest either high status or very committed eccentricity. The tallest of them wears a hat. You are instantly wary. Hats in diplomatic situations tend to be statements. This one is a towering affair, triangular in design, adorned with what appears to be pressed herbs and a small, very still lizard. You nod politely, unsure whether to comment. They come from the Low Marches. Aldrich continues bearing a message from Duchess Renild, and possibly a gift. The item in the covered basket has not yet made its intentions clear. Noted you murmur, brushing past him and ascending the 2 slightly higher steps to your designated receiving platform, a modest elevation in the stone floor that exists solely to make you appear more authoritative. You settle into the official chair, the one with the less creaky legs, and a cushion that's only mildly damp from last week's rain incident. The delegation steps forward as a unit, the tall hat arriving first, its lizard gazing at you with what can only be described as sleepy suspicion. The hat bearer bows deeply. "Your Grace," he intones, "I am Envoy Thorin of Renild's court. We bring greetings, seasonal produce," and he gestures vaguely a few concerns. Concerns. You repeat, because nothing about that phrase sounds like it can be solved with cordiality and muffins. "Yes," Thorin says, unfurling a scroll from the sleeve of his robe, which rustles ominously. "Firstly, there is the matter of the shared stream." "Ah, yes. The stream. That quiet, muddy trickle that runs between your western boundary and Renild's tulip fields, now apparently a source of profound geopolitical tension. It seems, Thorin says delicately, that one of your castle's geese has taken up residence along the bank and has been territorial. Define territorial, you say, because you already know it's bad, but need it in writing. "There was a boot," Thorin replies. "An ambassador's boot, bitten clean through. Also, a small satchel of correspondence, now presumed lost. By the goose, by the goose." Aldrich shifts behind you, scribbling something onto a tablet that likely reads "Goose Protocol" urgently. "I will address the creature's behavior," you say, "with royal assurance." "Has it been given a name?" "Not officially," Thorin replies, "though among our staff it is now known as the Guardian." Appropriate, you say, already imagining the awkward apology letter to follow. What else? There is also, Thorin continues consulting a second scroll, the issue of sound. Sound. Yes. Our far fields report nightly disturbances, a sort of humming. Your eyes narrow. How long has this been occurring? 3 nights, he says, since the last crescent moon. Does it match the frequency of a jar? Thorin blinks. A jar. Never mind. You lean back slightly, absorbing this coincidence, if it is that. The humming jar under your stairs. The humming heard across the border. Unconnected, perhaps? But in your experience, humming is rarely innocent. Thorin gestures to the basket carried by the smallest delegate, a pale, nervous youth with one eyebrow and a powerful aversion to eye contact. As a token of peace, he says the Duchess sends a gift. The youth steps forward and places the basket at your feet. There is no movement from within. You wait a moment, then lift the cloth. Inside is a single, surprisingly large cheese, round, pale yellow, with a wax seal and a polite scent. It is labeled Reconciliation Wheel. Mild. It's not enchanted, Thorin assures quickly, though it was stored near a lute for some time. Appreciated, you reply. We shall place it near our pantry and monitor its diplomatic leanings. The delegation offers shallow bows and retreats to the side of the hall, where they are ushered gently toward the guest wing by Gregory, who has appeared once again with the unflappable expression of someone who's just seen too many cheeses to be surprised anymore. You remain seated on the platform, eyes fixed on the cheese, the scrolls, the lizard, and the growing awareness that the day is folding into one of those peculiar patterns where everything becomes a subplot. Aldrich, you say, finally summon Morella again. I'd like her to examine the humming jar for traces of interterritorial resonance, and possibly to inspect the cheese, just in case. At once, Aldrich replies, vanishing in that way stewards do when consequences are not their responsibility. Alone again, you rise and step down from the platform. The lizard blinks slowly as you pass clearly, unimpressed with your command of the room. The scrolls remain in your hand. You unfurl one and read a few more lines. They mention weather shifts, a missing gardener, and something about unusual growth patterns in Renild's sunflower patch. You begin walking toward the scriptorium, where messages are stored and misfiled with great efficiency. The corridors are unusually quiet now, save for the soft slap of your slippers on stone, and the distant hum you can no longer pretend is just in your memory. You take a right at the tapestry of the Battle of Bread Hill, an artistic retelling of a food riot that ended in a bakery siege and a truce made with raisins, and descend a short flight of stairs toward the record rooms. There, in the narrowest drawer of the oldest cabinet, is where the notes about past humming incidents live, usually ignored and often mocked. You begin to sift through them, paging past drawings of bells, bees, and a truly unfortunate attempt to sketch an echo. And just as you find a reference to resonant jars with luminous behavior, a shadow crosses the threshold. It's Gregory. He doesn't speak, just raises one eyebrow in that particular way that means something has either arrived or escaped. You glance up, your hand still on the parchment, and follow his gaze toward the high window where a faint, shimmering pulse of light flickers once, then fades. Then fades, leaving behind only the echo of color that might have been purple, or perhaps just an ambitious shade of gray. You remain still for a moment, hand frozen on the parchment, eyes squinting slightly toward the high window, as if squinting harder might reverse time, or at least retrieve the flicker for closer inspection. Gregory doesn't move, either a rare occurrence for someone who usually responds to any mystery with the slow motion shuffle of experience and caution. Was that you begin a reflection? Gregory tilts his head, not unless the clouds have learned how to twinkle. You glance down at the document beneath your fingers. The old ink faded, but still legible. The margin bears a curious doodle, a jar unmistakably with short vertical lines drawn around it, like vibration marks. Next to it, in tight script, the words "Observed near Western Garden, humming, consistent pulse, uncertain," resulted in temporary forgetfulness in 3 chickens and a very confused fence post. You blink. The fence post forgot something. Gregory leans over and reads the note. Or perhaps someone forgot the fence post. Hard to say. The archivist had peculiar phrasing. You roll the scroll closed and tuck it under your arm. We need to find out who cataloged this. If jars have been humming long enough to be filed under fence-related confusion, then someone must have studied them. Gregory nods. That would be the late archivist Renwick. Late as in quite. He was buried with his favorite index cards. You sigh. That tracks. Renwick was a man of detail, questionable fashion, and a strict belief that all mysteries should be alphabetized. Did he have an apprentice? Possibly. Or a roommate. No one could ever tell. You return to the hall, scroll in hand, thinking. The archivist's quarters had remained largely untouched since his passing, mostly due to superstition, partly due to the number of loose quills and the ominous number of labeled jars he left behind. You make your way toward the west wing, passing through the long gallery of royal oddities where the bust of a former queen seems to follow you with mildly judgmental eyes. The door to Renwick's chamber creaks open at your touch, revealing a room that smells of ink dust and something faintly herbal, possibly self-defensive. The shelves are stacked with boxes and bundles of notes tied in string, each labeled in microscopic script that suggests Renwick distrusted handwriting, larger than a grain of rice. You take one step inside, then pause as a paper gently flutters from a high shelf and lands at your feet. Gregory picks it up. Loose memory, he reads aloud. Filed under inconsistencies, notes missing, possibly by design. Handle with ambiguity. That sounds like him, you say, brushing aside a cobweb that appears to have filed its own tax records. You begin searching the shelves, pulling down folders marked auditory anomalies, artifacts, possibly judgmental, and unscheduled illumination. Each one contains notes, sketches, and occasionally recipes for what may be entirely theoretical stews. Eventually, you find a section dedicated to jars. Notable. A short list, but informative. Several jars are mentioned, all discovered at odd moments, under stairs, behind fireplaces, once inside a clock that never worked, but always knew when the baker arrived. Each jar had one thing in common: an intermittent, humming, faint glow, and a tendency to attract birds. You close the folder slowly. Morella needs to know this, and perhaps the beekeeper. He's still recovering from the turret incident, Gregory reminds you. The bees, apparently, staged a formation. Fine, you say. Then fetch the candlemaster. If anyone understands the behavior of things that glow mysteriously, it's someone who's watched wax behave under stress. As Gregory vanishes again, you gather a few more scrolls into a bundle and head back toward your private study, where the fire is kept modest and the chairs are only slightly biased against spines. On the way, you pass two maids whispering about the humming being heard now in the northern corridor near the portrait of Duke Alwyn the Unreadable. One of them claims the eyes moved. The other insists the humming was in harmony with a passing lute. Neither observation comforts you. At the study, you settle into the deep chair near the hearth and spread the scrolls across your lap. The patterns are strange, inconsistent, and yet increasingly impossible to dismiss. Some jars glowed brighter near bells. Others went silent near mirrors. One was said to weep during thunderstorms, though the report was filed by someone who had just eaten suspicious mushrooms. There are no conclusions, just notations. And one final note pinned to the last scroll in a different hand than Renwick's smoother, more angular. It reads, "If the hum spreads, do not listen too closely." Curiosity echoes. You look up as the fire flickers. Gregory returns with the candlemaster in tow, a short, broad woman named Odeline, who wears a cloak that smells of wax and burnt lavender. She bows stiffly. "You have glowing behavior," she asks without introduction. "And a hum." "Describe the hum," she says already, unpacking a case filled with miniature tapers, polished lenses, and what appears to be a fork tuned for illumination frequency. "Low," you say. "Steady. Gentle but deliberate. Similar to a lullaby hummed by architecture." "Fascinating," she mutters. "Any interference with poultry?" "Just a goose," Gregory offers. "Territorial? Could be unrelated," she says. "But then again, geese often detect things before we do." She lights a small pale blue candle and watches the flame. It flickers once, then steadies. "The air here is disturbed," she murmurs. "Not by wind, not by temperature, but by something. Listening." You blink. "Listening to what? To itself, perhaps," she says. "Or to something older." "Do you have mirrors?" "In the castle." "No, in the room with the jar." "None that I saw." "Good," she says. They confuse the resonance. She snuffs the candle. "I'll need to examine the jar directly, and I'll bring my silent bell." "Your what?" "A bell that doesn't ring," she says, "but things notice it anyway." As she leaves to prepare the fire, beside you dims. The shadows shift slow and long, and from somewhere beyond the door, a faint note rises low and persistent, not quite music, not quite warning. You stand moving slowly toward the hall, your hand brushing the edge of the door frame, where something small and metallic now rests, a seal, broken and discarded, bearing a symbol you don't recognize but feel you should. A triangle, a curve, and beneath it, just barely visible, a lizard. A lizard etched with such delicate precision that it seems almost to breathe. You crouch beside the seal, lifting it gently with one hand, turning it over. The back bears no mark, just the faint impression of wax that once held it firm to a scroll, or perhaps a door, or perhaps something more peculiar still. You glance over your shoulder, half expecting Gregory to appear with another strange observation, or a towel, depending on what he thought you needed. But the hallway remains empty, the flickering torchlight bending the shadows into shapes that vaguely resemble old coats and unresolved debts. You tuck the seal into the inner fold of your robe beside the stitched linen note about the humming under the stairs, which now seems less like whimsy and more like early warning. You straighten slowly, listening. There it is again, that faint hum, like a sigh held too long by someone made of stone. It pulses gently through the wall, not loud enough to be threatening, not soft enough to ignore. You make your way down the corridor, toward the direction of the hum, toward the north wing, and the portrait of Duke Alwyn, the unreadable. The air grows slightly cooler, and with it heavier, as if the stones themselves are reluctant to share what they know. You pass a window, its glass pane etched with symbols, worn smooth by years of indifferent weather. For a moment, you see a shape in the reflection that doesn't quite match your movement, just a flicker, an echo, but when you turn, there's nothing. Of course there isn't. Duke Alwyn awaits. His portrait hangs in a niche framed by carved stone foliage that never grew and never will. The Duke himself, painted with the kind of realism that makes you vaguely uncomfortable, stares back, with both eyes slightly off-kilter, and a mouth that might be smiling, or might simply be resisting the urge to say something historical. As you approach, the hum increases just slightly, and you notice something you've never seen before. A line of text barely visible etched into the base of the frame. It reads, "Where silence gathers memory, waits." You're not entirely sure what that means, but it feels like something people in old robes would nod at solemnly, while not explaining. You reach out to touch the inscription, and the humming ceases. Not gradually, instantly, as though it realized it had been noticed and didn't appreciate the attention. The sudden silence is startling, not the absence of sound, but the presence of its loss. Behind you, a door creaks open. Not a loud creak, not even a dramatic one, just the sort of creak a door makes when it has something awkward to share. You turn slowly. It's the door to the old study of Duke Alwyn himself, locked for decades, its key lost during an unfortunate event involving an owl and a poorly timed sneeze. The door stands ajar now, revealing darkness that's more patient than foreboding. You step forward, because of course you do, and enter the room. Dust coats everything in the kind of careful layer that suggests dusting would be considered vandalism. Shelves line the walls, many of them empty, others stacked with thick tomes whose titles have long since surrendered to time. On the desk sits another jar. This one is not glowing, not humming, just sitting there, waiting. You approach cautiously, noting its shape, rounder than the first, with a faint spiral design running from base to lid. It's capped, sealed with wax, and stamped with the same lizard sigil now nestled in your robe. You don't open it, not yet. Instead, you look around the desk, hoping for notes or diagrams, or perhaps a conveniently labeled set of instructions, like how to handle mildly bewitched objects. You find a ledger, its pages cracked, but legible. Inside are entries written in tight, precise handwriting. They detail observations of sounds, hums, murmurs, even a musical sighing once recorded during a lightning storm. The Duke was documenting them, categorizing them, perhaps even listening back. The last entry stands out. It reads, "A second jar unearthed. Different tone. Resonance interferes with memory when near candlelight. Test pending. Must not forget. Must not forget." The words "must not forget" are underlined 3 times, the final stroke digging through the page and scarring the one beneath it. You close the ledger. You pick up the jar. It is heavier than it looks, slightly warm. Still silent. As you turn, a soft knock sounds from the open door. Marela stands there, holding a satchel and a look of cautious professionalism. "Odelin sent me," she says. "Said you'd found something potentially inconvenient. Possibly you admit holding out the jar." She doesn't take it immediately. Instead, she studies it, then glances at the ledger still open on the desk. Was this Duke Alwyn's? Seems so. She nods slowly, then steps into the room, careful not to disturb anything else. She pulls from her satchel a small vial of herbs, uncorks it, and waves it near the jar. The contents do not react. Dormant, she mutters. But aware. Aware. Like a hedgehog that's decided. Napping is more polite than engaging. You do not ask how she knows what that feels like. There was another one, you say. Under the stairs. Humming. Now in your infirmary. It stopped humming an hour ago, she replies, right after the sky flickered. You glance toward the high window again, though there's no flicker now, only steady afternoon light, pretending not to be worried. 2 jars, you say. Possibly more. Almost certainly more, Marela corrects. If one noble was collecting them, odds are others were too. Nobles love collections. We need to catalog them, cross-reference locations, determine whether they're connected to the humming reports. And the goose, she asks. Let's keep that separate for now. She tucks the jar into her satchel carefully, like one might store a cranky egg, and nods toward the hall. We'll meet in the infirmary. Odeline has lit her silent bell. If anything reacts, it'll do so there. You follow her back through the corridor, past the eyes of the Duke's portrait, which now seem just slightly more symmetrical than before. The hum does not return, but the silence grows companionable, like a cat who's decided you're not interesting enough to bother. You reach the infirmary doors just as a page runs past in the opposite direction, yelling something about a missing ladder and a noise that came from a well but didn't sound entirely like water. You glance at Morella. She raises an eyebrow. You think it's related? At this point, you murmur everything might be. Inside, Odeline stands by the original jar, which now rests on a low wooden table surrounded by unlit candles. The silent bell sits nearby, unmoving, but somehow humming, just faintly through your bones. You step closer, unrolling the old ledger and placing it beside the jar. The light in the room shifts slightly, as if remembering something. And from behind the table, from the edge of a forgotten shelf, comes the sound of something small, sliding softly but deliberately, like a letter beneath a locked door or a shoe retreating from commitment. The three of you freeze, not dramatically, but in that quietly upright way that people do when unsure whether the furniture has begun moving of its own accord. Morella, ever the professional, is the first to respond. She steps forward, her boots whispering across the stone floor with the subtle confidence of a person who's seen stranger things than an ambulatory shelf. She kneels beside the motion, gently moving aside a folded tapestry that smells of mothballs and second-hand incense. Beneath it, something glints in the candlelight, a third jar smaller than the others, half wedged between the wall and a stack of forgotten bandages, labeled possibly clean. Another one, she murmurs, reaching toward it. Did you place this here? Odeline asks, still watching the first jar with the silent bell balanced carefully in her palm. No, Morella replies, lifting the new jar. This one is matte gray, no glow, no hum, but oddly cool to the touch, as if it had spent time pondering regret in a root cellar. The wax seal on the lid is cracked, but still clings, and etched into the glass is a small looping inscription in a language you don't recognize, but feel you might dream in. It moved, you say, quietly, or was moved, or wanted to be found. Morella adds, setting it on the table beside the others. Odeline watches closely, her eyes flickering to the bell, which remains motionless. No reaction, she mutters. No pulse. Maybe they cancel each other out, you suggest. Or maybe they're waiting for something. Morella reaches into her satchel and pulls out a thin wand made of polished bone and wrapped in copper wire. She holds it over each jar in turn. The wand buzzes gently above the first two, but remains still over the third. dormant, she says again, but intentionally so. You look down at the ledger from Duke Alwyn's desk. The final entries now seem less cryptic and more desperate. Repeated notes about timing resonance and an odd diagram that looks suspiciously like a floor plan of the castle rotated sideways and annotated with small ticks along the western wall. Do you think you begin? Slowly, they're positioned according to some pattern. If so, Odeline says it isn't architectural. I've mapped the castle's harmonics. This doesn't fit. But what if it's not about harmonics? Morella asks. What if it's about listening? What if they're not resonating to something, they're relaying it? You stare at her, relaying what memory she says simply, or warning, or intent. Odeline nods slowly, as if that were a reasonable thing to say. It would explain the silent bell's reaction earlier. Something heard it. Something adjusted. You walk to the high window and look out. The sky remains clouded, but the kind of clouded that feels deliberate, like someone draped a slightly damp curtain across the sun for dramatic effect. The village below bustles as usual, unaware, unbothered. But the castle has begun to feel like it's holding its breath. There was a flicker, you say aloud, a moment of shimmer, before Morella arrived in the archive, and the humming stopped then too. Something synchronized, Morella mutters. Not all the jars, just one, but enough. There may be more, you say, still staring out the window. Not just here, not just this keep. If Alwyn was documenting them, and Renwick, and if that seal, the one with the lizard, if it's part of something, you trail off, not because you're unsure, but because Gregory has just appeared in the doorway with a look that suggests a new development has presented itself, and it does not involve cheese or soup. Your Grace, he says, adjusting his sleeves. You're going to want to see this. You follow him through the hall, past corridors that feel ever so slightly too quiet, past a hallway where someone has abandoned a lute in the middle of the floor with a single string plucked out of tune. He leads you up a narrow stairwell to the north turret, where a narrow balcony overlooks the surrounding woods. You've stood here before, mostly during festivals, and once during a thunderstorm, when you thought you saw something poetic about mist. But today, the view has changed. In the clearing beyond the forest's edge, where only wild herbs and overconfident squirrels usually roam, stands a figure, dressed in gray, still watching. Who is it, you ask? We don't know, Gregory replies, but they've been there for over an hour. Haven't moved, haven't spoken, just watching. You narrow your eyes. The figure's cloak flutters slightly, not from wind, but from something less cooperative, like a breath held too long. Any sign of a weapon? None. But the scouts are uneasy. They say the birds won't go near the clearing. Which birds? All of them. You step back, mind turning over slowly, like a mill wheel in low water. Have we received any messages from Renilda's court since this morning? Not yet. Send a rider. Ask if they've had any strange occurrences. And mention the jars. Gregory nods and vanishes again. You stare once more at the figure in the clearing, who hasn't moved, hasn't turned, and doesn't appear to blink. You return to the infirmary, where Odeline is now drawing circles of wax around the jars, and Morella is muttering to herself while mapping the last known positions of anything that hummed in the last 6 months. Something's coming together, you say, but it's not finished yet. How do you know? Morella asks. You reach into your robe and pull out the cracked wax seal, laying it on the table beside the jars. The lizard symbol gleams faintly, because this wasn't meant to be found alone. Odeline lights a fresh candle. The room grows warmer. The hum returns faint, like the beginning of a thought echoing from nowhere, and then from under the floorboards. From under the floorboards, the hum rises soft and circular, the kind of sound that seems to curve around corners and politely dodge your expectations. It vibrates gently through your boots, not sharply, not alarmingly, just enough to suggest the castle itself might be practicing scales. Odeline stills her hand, mid-wax line, eyes narrowing as the vibration resonates faintly through the wooden table. Morella tilts her head, listening as though waiting for the sound to explain itself. It doesn't. It continues steady, like an idea whispered across centuries. You move slowly to the far corner of the infirmary, to a rug that's been there since before your reign, and possibly before basic sanitation. You lift it, revealing worn planks, one of which is slightly darker, slightly looser, and now vibrating in sync with the jars. This floor doesn't lead to the cellar, you say quietly. No, Morella confirms. This section doesn't lead to anything at all. You press down on the board. It shifts, not easily, but willingly, as though it has waited. Odeline retrieves a narrow pry rod from her bag. Why she carries. One remains politely unasked and begins to lift the board with the kind of practiced care usually reserved for opening letters sealed by ominous families. The board comes free with a reluctant groan and reveals a narrow shaft descending into dark stone. There are steps, not modern, older than the rest of the infirmary, possibly older than the infirmary itself. You glance at the others. This wasn't on any map, Morella whispers, not even the suspiciously edited ones. How far down, you ask? Odeline leans over the hole and drops a coin. You all wait. 5 seconds, then 6, then 7. Then the soft, distant sound of a small clink, like a coin, landing gently on memory. Deep enough, she says. Morella lights a small lantern with a flame tinted green, for reasons she refuses to elaborate on. You lower yourself into the shaft. First, the old stones rough against your hands, the air growing steadily cooler with each step. The hum grows louder, not oppressive, but layered like multiple jars, all thinking at once. The descent takes longer than expected. 40 steps, then 50. By 72, you begin to wonder if the castle was built atop a hill, or perhaps a very forgetful cavern. Finally, the shaft opens into a chamber. Small, round, dry. Carved stone, ancient and precise. The walls are lined with alcoves, each holding a jar. Not glowing, not humming. Silent. Watching. There are dozens, maybe hundreds, placed with such mathematical intention that even the dust respects the geometry. Morella enters behind you, her lantern casting gentle rings of light across the jars. Odeline follows, setting her silent bell on the center pedestal, which rises from the floor like a thoughtful mushroom. You step forward and examine one of the jars. The seal is intact, bearing the same lizard symbol. But beneath it, carved directly into the glass, is a number. 17, you read aloud. The next jar bears 18. Another 19. You turn. They're numbered. Morella moves clockwise around the chamber, reading aloud softly. 22. 23. This one's in the 50s. A sequence Odeline murmurs, but incomplete. Gaps in the shelves. Do they correlate to anything Morella asks? Dates. Coordinates. Bad decisions. You run your fingers along the stone. They were placed here deliberately. But who, when? And why? Odeline adds, are some jars missing? Morella kneels near the central pedestal, brushing away a thin layer of dust. There, etched into the stone base, is an inscription in the same looping script from the third jar. Can you read it, you ask? Parts of it, she replies. It's old, very old. Something about vessels of remembrance and to be gathered when the time forgets itself. Poetic, you say, also unhelpfully vague. It mentions the echoing day. Morella continues. That's familiar. You nod. Renwick wrote about that once, called it a myth, said it was the day sound itself would remember what silence forgot. That's the kind of sentence that makes you spill tea on purpose, Odelin mutters. You walk slowly around the chamber, trying to piece together what you're seeing. These jaws, these numbers, this place. It's not just storage. It's preparation, a library of resonance. Then your foot strikes something small and metallic. You bend down. It's another seal identical to the one in your robe, but this one isn't cracked. It's warm, fresh, as if it had only just been placed there. You look up. One of the alcoves now has a jar you don't remember seeing before. Slightly ajar, the seal unbroken the hum, just beginning to rise. You take a step back. Morella joins you, squinting at the jar. That wasn't there when we entered. Is it glowing? Odelin asks. Only faintly. You reach for the jar, but Morella catches your wrist. Wait. If this one just arrived, then someone or something is still placing them. You freeze. You mean now, yes, and not just here. The hum begins to harmonize, faint threads of sound weaving through the chamber like spider silk strung between memory and foresight. The silent bell trembles slightly. Then, from above, from the infirmary, you hear the unmistakable crash of something heavy falling. And then the sound of footsteps, not hurried, not panicked, just calm and very, very deliberate. You all look up. Odelin whispers, "We're not alone, not alone, and not in the way one sometimes imagines. They're not alone, such as when reading late by candlelight, or finding a boot missing and suspecting subtle betrayal. No, this is the sort of not alone that manifests in soft, confident footsteps echoing down a vertical shaft that had until a moment ago been entirely unvisited by modern footwear. You and Morella exchange a glance, both instinctively stepping away from the pedestal, while Odelin carefully shields the glowing jar with one hand and her silent bell with the other. The steps continue slow, evenly spaced, with the kind of patience normally reserved for people who always know what time it is, without checking. You strain to hear more, the scrape of a heel against stone, a small clink as something glass or metal is adjusted, and then a pause. Whoever is descending has stopped just before entering the chamber, remaining hidden in the shadows of the shaft above. "Who's there?" you ask, not loudly, just enough for your voice to reach the listener. Silence follows, a long one. Then, at last, a reply. Do you know what jar this is? The voice is soft, dry, neither young nor ancient, but age in the way a sealed room might age a tone that implies it has not been spoken in a while, but was never in doubt about how it should sound. That one, the voice continues, doesn't hum. It remembers. Morella, still crouched beside the pedestal, stiffens. How do you know that? Because I placed it, the voice replies simply. Or rather, I returned it, as it was meant to be. You step forward, peering up the shaft, though the light does little to reveal the figure. Step into the room, you say. Let us see you. Another pause, then a shuffle. The feet appear first boots of soft leather, old, but cared for, followed by the hem of a robe, the color of ash left after ceremonial fire. And then the figure steps into the chamber. Tall, thin, a face mostly hidden beneath a hood, though the mouth is visible, calm, unbothered, and the faintest bit amused. My name, the figure says, is Irian. I was once the assistant to Archivist Renwick, though only unofficially. He preferred not to acknowledge company unless necessary. You were believed lost, Morella says, possibly absorbed by a filing cabinet. I simply left, Irian replies, quietly. When I realized the jars had started to respond to the wrong kinds of questions. You glance at the jar. He referred to the one that hadn't been there before. It still hums faintly, but more than that, it seems to radiate attention. Why return now, you ask? Because the pattern's nearing completion. Irian says, stepping around the pedestal, not unkindly, but with the casual surety of someone who has visited this chamber often. The chambers are waking. The jars have begun to align, and when they do, the castle will remember what it was built for. You blink. What it was built for. Not just to house kings and squabbling. Dinner politics, Irian says, but to hold memory. Real memory. From before history was written with ink and pride. This castle is a hinge. The jars are keys, and when enough are returned, the door beneath us will open. You instinctively look down though the floor appears unchanged. What's beneath us? Something older than silence, Irian replies, and far more patient. Odelina clears her throat. And this door, what precisely does it lead to? To the first sound, Irian replies, as though quoting. That which echoed before echoing was a word. That which was sealed to keep forgetting possible. Morella frowns. That sounds ominously metaphoric. All ancient truths are, Irian says, but this one is quite literal. You take a step back, processing, and the jars, these memories, what are they storing? Not just memories, Irian says, moments, harmonics, imprints of sound, thought, motion, captured at pivotal points and anchored in vessels designed to last beyond decay. He gestures toward the new jar. Each one carries a tone, a signal. When played together, they create a map, not of places, but of time. Odalyn is now holding her silent bell a little more firmly, so if enough jars are returned, the chamber will resonate. Irian finishes, and the resonance will unseal what lies below. You look at Morella. She's biting the inside of her cheek, which usually means she's thinking in multiple directions at once. And what happens if it opens, she asks. What happens if this first sound is released? Irian's expression doesn't change. That is not known. Renwick believed it would restore something long suppressed. Others believed it would erase everything layered on top of it. Which do you believe, you ask? I believe, Irian says quietly, that it will change what we understand as silence. You exhale slowly. It's not quite a threat, not quite a promise, just a possibility with profound consequences. And if we choose not to return the jars, you ask, then the hum will continue. Irian replies, slowly, carefully, but it will grow, because memory resists being forgotten. The chamber, once still, now feels subtly aware. The jars seem to lean ever so slightly toward the center, as if in collective breath. You should return to the surface, Irian says at last. There will be others soon. More jars, more echoes. The castle is listening, and it's beginning to remember what to ask. He turns and walks toward the shaft without another word, disappearing into the dim spiral of the stair. For a long moment, no one moves. Then Morella stands and brushes her hands on her coat. Well, she says, I suppose we're not in the business of minor mysteries anymore. Odalyn sighs and lifts the new jar. We'll need to prepare the resonance circle and notify the royal geometer, the one who only speaks in riddles. No, the other one, the one who hums while measuring. You begin to climb the shaft. Again, the faint resonance of the jars trailing you like a forgotten melody, rising behind you, not as a warning, but as an invitation that lingers even as you emerge from the shaft, shoes dusted with old stone, mind echoing with thoughts too vague to be useful and too persistent to ignore. The infirmary above feels subtly changed now, as though it knows what lies below, and has chosen with quiet dignity not to comment. Odalyn sets the jar carefully on the table again, arranging it beside the others in a configuration that looks deceptively random, but causes the humming to shift slightly into something like agreement. Morella flips through the ledger, her fingers pausing on diagrams that now seem far less speculative. "We'll need to measure this," she says. "Properly. If what Irian said is even halfway accurate, we need spatial alignment. And we need the geometer you add. The one who hums," she confirms. "Not the Riddler." You nod and dispatch Gregory, who reappears instantly, as if summoned by plot, and vanishes just as quickly with a nod and the vague rustle of dependable footwear. While waiting, you gather the wax seals. 2 cracked, 1 pristine, and 1 from the new jar that still feels faintly warm, and line them beside the jars. Each one bears the same lizard symbol, but with minute variations. One curls left. Another points slightly up. Morella studies them with narrowed eyes. "They're directional," she mutters, "like compasses with personalities, or postures," Odeline suggests, perhaps indicating alignment. "Or attitude," you add. "If they start slouching, I'm leaving." Before anyone can respond, the door opens, and in walks the royal geometer, a man of approximately average height, but exceptional circularity. His cloak is patched with diagrams of spirals, angles, and occasionally very well-fed triangles. He is humming a melody that repeats every 7.5 notes, and he doesn't stop, even as he bows politely. "Ah," he says, mid-hum, "you've disturbed the quiet places." "We didn't mean to," Morella offers. "We only meant to investigate the aggressive humming." "They're not humming at you?" the geometer says, peering at the jars. "They're humming through you." There's a difference. Subtle, but musical. He unrolls a scroll the length of a small dining table and spreads it out beside the jars. The parchment is covered in concentric circles, interlocking patterns, and occasional annotations that appear to be jokes made in geometry. Now he says, selecting a compass from his belt the size of a turkey leg. "Let's see where you sit." He begins measuring the distance between jars, muttering numbers, and adjusting tiny silver weights on the parchment. Occasionally, he stops to hum, not to himself, but it seems to the jars. After several minutes of scribbling and adjusting, he steps back and nods. "You've got resonance creep," he announces. "Just as I suspected." "Is that bad?" Odeline asks. "Oh no," he says brightly. "It's extremely curious. The jars are aligning in a curve that bends around the castle's original footprint. They're tracking a harmonic spiral, so they're forming a path, you ask. "No," he says. "A sentence." "I'm sorry," Morella says. Yes, The geometer continues scribbling more. Each jar, each hum is a part of a phrase. Not in words. Mind you, words are terribly inefficient. In tone. The placement of the jars corresponds to points on a linguistic resonance pattern. It's a sentence, but you have to feel it. Listen with your spine. We're storing musical grammar, you murmur. Something like that. He agrees. A thought so old it was buried under tone instead of dirt. Now it's almost readable. But it needs completion. A final note. A missing jar. Morella asks. Several, likely. Scattered, displaced, forgotten. Some may be mimicking other objects to avoid detection. Jars can be sneaky that way. Can you predict where they are, you ask? The geometer hums again softly and points to his scroll. There's a pattern forming, a sort of melodic map. I'll need to follow the curve. Check the arc against old structural records. Maybe consult with a particularly knowledgeable stone. We have a few, Morella mutters. I'll begin at dawn, the geometer declares. Harmonics are always best traced on an empty stomach and a hopeful disposition. We'll keep these guarded, you promise. Can you draw the next likely locations? Certainly, he replies, already humming again, as he begins to sketch a series of looping lines on fresh parchment. Start here, he says, tapping a spot near the west granary. It's not resonating yet, but the silence is suggestive. That sounds like a metaphor, Odeline says. It's not, he replies cheerfully. It's acoustics. As he rolls up his scrolls and exits, you sit quietly beside the jars. The hum has settled into a background drone, not unpleasant, but persistent. You close your eyes and listen. Not just with your ears. You try just for a moment to feel what Irian described. A sentence forming, a memory assembling itself out of tone and placement and old stone sighing beneath the weight of forgotten purpose. You don't understand it yet, but you believe it's real. Morella stands and begins arranging supplies for fieldwork. Odeline prepares protective wraps for transporting the more fragile jars. The castle creaks gently in the breeze, and from somewhere, perhaps above, perhaps below, comes the faintest new hum, not from a jar, but from something just outside the castle walls. Just outside the castle walls, and faint though it is, the hum arrives with the peculiar authority of a note that knows it belongs in the arrangement. You, Morella, and Odeline exchange glances that have become by now almost conversational eyebrows, slightly lifted, corners of mouths turned in that way that says, of course, another hum splendid. The geometer had said to start near the west granary, and so, with light packs and an early chill curling at your ankles, you find yourself walking slowly across the damp courtyard before sunrise. The stones underfoot glisten from dew, and in the stillness of that hour before the cooks ignite their first griddle, even the castle itself seems unsure if it's awake. Morella leads the way, holding a thin rod of copper etched with calibration marks she insists were once used by hilltop bellmasters. Odilien follows, carrying a jar wrapping kit and a small satchel of emergency wax. You, by contrast, bring only a notebook and a faint sense of dignified confusion. The granary appears, as it always does, squat content and vaguely flower-scented. Its roof sags just enough to suggest wisdom, and its shutters clatter when they think no one is listening. But as you approach the south-facing wall, Morella halts, head tilted. There, she says, you feel that you do. Not sound exactly, more the echo of sound's decision to arrive soon. A potential hum, a pre-hum. You place your hand on the stone and feel a subtle vibration, as though the wall is remembering a chord it hasn't sung in centuries. Behind here, Morella murmurs, the cellar. No, Odilien says, pointing to the ground. Below, even that, foundations. You all circle to the rear, where a disused trapdoor slumps in the grass like it regrets something. Its hinges protest when opened, but not enough to stop you. A narrow set of steps leads down into a chamber you've never entered and possibly never knew existed. Lanterns reveal a small subterranean room, stone-lined, dry, and oddly well-organized for a place that's technically not on any map. Barrels stand quietly in rows, sacks of grain too dusty to be recent rest against the walls. And there, near the back, partially hidden beneath an old cloak that might once have been ceremonial or just very dramatic, is another jar. This one hums clearly, soft and resonant, with a tone that feels round, like a well-formed sentence with polite punctuation. Its seal is intact, the lizard emblem curling rightward this time, and the wax has a slight greenish hue, like moss that's memorized etiquette. Morella bends down studying it. This is older, she says, not just stored anchored. It was placed with intention. And it's part of the curve you add, unrolling the geometer's map and cross-referencing the arcs. It fits. Odilien wraps the jar carefully, but even through the cloth, it hums persistent, as if eager to rejoin the others. Bring it back to the chamber, Morella says. I want to check if the resonance adjusts. And what about this room, you ask, scanning the stone for inscriptions? There's nothing obvious. But when you press your palm to the eastern wall, you feel a difference in texture, a shallow carving, faint and worn. You fetch a lantern and hold it close. It's not a picture. It's not even writing. It's notation, music perhaps, or something musical adjacent. What do you make of this, you ask? Morella squints. Looks like a sequence. Not quite scale, maybe spacing, or intervals, Odelana says, between tones, like the silent bells whisper patterns, which you say slowly suggests this wall was not built to support grain, but to resonate with what Morella asks, with everything Odelina murmurs. You step back. The room feels subtly louder now. Not in decibels, but in presence. Like the act of noticing it has invited it to continue. You ascend with the jar, leaving the chamber respectfully as the trap door closes with a thump that feels more like punctuation than noise. Back at the castle, the jars are waiting. Irian is not present, nor is the geometer, but the central pedestal hums a bit louder as the new jar is placed beside the others. The frequency shifts slightly more cohesive now, as though the sentence it's forming has acquired a verb. Morella compares notes, checking tone intervals. "We're missing one here," she says, pointing to a dip in the arc, and likely another on the far end. At this pace, you ask how long to find them. Hard to say, she admits. If the jars want to be found, they appear. But some may still be disguised. Then we widen the search, you say. Library kitchens, west attic. Check anything with shelves and a history of inexplicable noises. Odelin sets to work, organizing runners and scribes. You retreat briefly to your chamber, where the fire has been lit, and a pot of tea waits with the silent judgment of steeped herbs. You sit open your notebook and write. The jars are not simply artifacts. They are messages. Memory stored in tone, awaiting arrangement. The castle, the walls, the very stones participants in a sentence too old to be spoken aloud. Irian claims it leads to the first sound. The geometer says it sings a phrase. What if it does both? You close the book and stare at the hearth. The flames flicker almost to a rhythm, and in the distance, the faintest possible hum, as if something far beneath the earth is tuning itself to a melody nearly remembered. Tuning itself so precisely that by the time you rise from your chair, the fire no longer crackles, but seems instead to pulse quietly in time with the distant hum, like a politely restrained drumroll. You make your way to the upper levels of the keep, where dust gathers like shy guests at a banquet, and the ceilings have forgotten how to be warm. The west attic, once used for storing banners, discarded armor, and various forms of ceremonial furniture that no longer matched the rest of the decor, is now your destination. Morella arrives shortly after you, holding a scribbled map with 3 exclamation points and a circle around the phrase "sound anomaly," confirmed by kitchen boy with excellent hearing. The boy had reported hearing a lullaby where no one was singing, which in this castle is frankly only mildly noteworthy. The attic stairs are long and narrow, the sort that creak not from wear, but from a sense of obligation. At the top, the door opens with a groan of hinges and the quiet exhale of stale, forgotten air. Inside the room stretches low and wide, its beams sagging gently, as if tired of being upright. Crates line the walls, each bearing chalk markings in various languages, some of which Morella admits may not technically exist. A faded tapestry leans in one corner, depicting a hunting scene in which none of the animals seem particularly concerned. You step carefully across the floor, which responds with the kind of cautious stability one expects from century-old boards. The hum up here is different, not louder, but conversational, as if it's waiting for someone to join in. Morella hums softly, a simple rising tone, and somewhere near the far wall, something responds, not in imitation, but in harmony. You follow the sound to a tall shelf stacked with folded cloth, unused candlesticks, and one very suspicious-looking urn. That Morella says, already reaching for it. "Most definitely," you reply. She lifts the urn gently. It's heavier than it looks, matte black, with no markings save for a faint ring of etching near the rim. Woolen, who has appeared seemingly through the wall, or perhaps by schedule, pulls out her resonance kit. "Let's see if this one joins the choir," she murmurs. She places a tuning disc nearby. The urn begins to vibrate faintly, then emits a low tone, more of a whisper than a hum, as if it were remembering a story and didn't want to interrupt itself. Morella pulls out a small resonance card and holds it close to the urn. Lines of ink, previously invisible, appear on the card, faint musical notation, with rests that seem longer than the staff allows. It's part of the phrase, she confirms. It might be a question or an apology, Woolen suggests. That would explain the pitch. You bring the urn carefully down the stairs and back to the resonance chamber, where the jars now sit in a curved arrangement that resembles a sentence written by someone with strong feelings about ellipses. The new addition slots perfectly into a gap previously marked with a string and a hopeful arrow. The moment it's placed, the tone of the entire collection shifts just slightly. A bit more curious, a bit less lonely. Morella steps back. The pattern's stabilizing. That means we're within reach of the central phrase. Any idea what it's saying, you ask? Not yet, she replies, but it's almost legible. We just need 2 or 3 more. You glance at the map, which now bears notes from the geometer, indicating potential locations based on the curvature of sound itself, including root cellar, unused scriptorium, and something marked only as North Gate resonance. Pocket, possibly goose-related. You delegate searches. Odalinen heads to the root cellar, where a previous jar had reportedly caused a barrel of pickled onions to weep audibly for 3 days. Morella takes the scriptorium, leaving you with the North Gate and its ambiguous goose theory. Gregory, who has returned from delivering correspondence with a face that says he read at least half of it, joins you as you pass through the outer hall. Any luck with the neighbors, you ask? Renild's court reports a similar hum beneath their bell tower, he says. No jars yet, but one of the priests reports dreams of music coming from beneath his bed. That tracks, you murmur. And the goose, still agitated, Gregory reports, but currently distracted by a beetle with opinions. You nod and continue toward the North Gate. The air grows brisk, and the light through the old stained glass panes makes patterns on the floor that shift as you walk. Squares circles the occasional lizard shape. At the gate, you pause. The goose stands there as expected, guarding a patch of gravel, with the kind of determined vigilance one usually reserves for priceless artifacts or slightly warm bread. We need to check beneath the archway, you say. The goose honks once low and warning. I will remind you, you tell it, that I outrank you. It stares unblinking. You sigh, then toss a crust of bread to the side. The goose trots after it, with betrayal in its step. Beneath the arch, behind a loose stone in the wall, you find another jar, small, cracked, barely humming. But it responds when you touch it, vibrating weakly, like a bell rung from far away. You cradle it gently and return to the castle. Morella and Odalinen are already waiting, both holding jars of their own, one shaped like an inkwell, the other like a collapsed teapot. Together, you place them on the pedestal. The circle completes. The hum shifts again, no longer uncertain. It now feels like a breath drawn in preparation to speak or sing, or perhaps simply remember. The jars vibrate in unison. the silent bell quivers. And from beneath the floor, deep below the resonance chamber, a new tone emerges. Low, steady, familiar. The castle, it seems, has started to replying not with words or symbols, but with a tone so steady, so deliberate, that even the cobwebs in the corners seem to pause out of courtesy. You, Morella, and Odeline stand still, each holding your breath in the uniquely reverent way that people do when something old has decided to speak again. The jars do not glow, but they lean slightly inward, drawn toward the center of the circle, as if tethered by memory. The silent bell no longer sits idly. It hums in counterpoint, low and pulsing, the kind of tone that reminds you of lullabies sung in stairwells and the forgotten resonance of old wells. Beneath your feet, the floor has begun to warm, not unpleasantly, not alarmingly, but with the suggestion that something beneath is no longer content to sleep. Morella checks the map, which is now annotated in no fewer than 3 inks, and one kind of chalk that only appears under particular lighting conditions. "We're at convergence," she says, eyes wide. The jars, the positioning, the phrase, they're harmonizing. "Is this the message?" Odeline asks, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet," Morella replies. "This is the key. The message is what it opens." You kneel near the central pedestal. The stone surface is faintly vibrating, tiny motes of dust dancing across it in little spiral patterns that form collapse and reform in rhythm. "There's something below you," say. "It's always been there," Odeline murmurs. "But now it wants us to notice." With slow, deliberate movement, you press your hand against the stone. There is a brief resistance, like pushing through thick wool, and then a click, not mechanical, not magical, but something stranger, the sound of memory unlocking. The pedestal shifts, lowering an inch into the ground, revealing a thin seam around its base. The tone deepens. You look at the jars, they begin to tilt inward more noticeably, their hums merging into a single, sustained chord that vibrates through your ribs like a kind word delivered by thunder. "Help me," you say, and Morella and Odeline move to your side. Together, you lift the pedestal. Top, it moves with unexpected ease, revealing a narrow spiral staircase descending into blackness so thick it feels like velvet soaked in history. No drafts rise from below. No scent of dust or decay. Just a quiet certainty that what lies down there has been waiting patiently for the right arrangement of tones and questions. You descend with lanterns, lit the stairs, curling tightly, carved from stone that is darker than the rest of the castle, and marked with faint etchings resembling waves, or perhaps musical staves turned inward. Each step seems to absorb the sound of your movement, as if the air here has been trained not to echo. After what feels like 100 turns, the stairs end in a chamber much smaller than you expect. Round with walls so smooth they seem to hum on their own. The room holds no furniture, no books, no jars. Just a single plinth in the center, and on it, a shallow bowl carved of obsidian, half filled with a liquid so still it might as well be mirror. You step forward cautiously, the hum now so faint it can only be felt, not heard. Morella holds up her lantern. Its light reflects off the liquid, which doesn't ripple, doesn't move until you speak. "We've come to listen," you say. The liquid shivers just slightly, and then the air shifts. Not the air itself, but what it carries. A sound, not words, not a voice, but something between them, a tone of deep memory, a phrase formed in tone, alone. You close your eyes and try to hear with more than ears. You feel it first, a sensation, like stepping into a room you haven't seen since childhood, or finding an old coat that still smells faintly of seasons past. Then images, not vivid, not sharp, but soft-edged and layered. A city that no longer exists. A tower that once sang with bells carved from stone. A library built underground, each book bound in silence. The memory of the first sound, not as a noise, but as a presence. A tone that once echoed across the land, marking time, not with calendars, but with resonance. The jars, you realize, did not store words. They stored directions, not geographic, but temporal, emotional, harmonic, a path through forgetting. Morella kneels beside the bowl, tears streaming down her face, though her expression is peaceful. Odilon stands with hands folded, nodding slightly, as if in conversation with something that cannot be seen. The tone continues steady as the bowl begins to shift, not the liquid, but the reflections it carries. Shapes appear, more jars, more chambers. A pattern so vast it stretches beyond the castle, beneath forests, through ruined keeps under rivers. A network of listening, of remembering. We are part of it, you whisper. The bowl pulses once, and then, from somewhere above, from the resonance chamber, the sound of a new jar arriving. You open your eyes. The tone remains, but lower now, patient, awaiting the next phrase. The castle breathes, and above you, another message begins to hum. Another message begins to hum, and though it is faint, almost timid, it carries that same uncanny certainty, as if the moment it arrived, it already knew where it belonged. You turn away from the obsidian bowl, which now rests silently, again, its surface calm, but no longer still. It reflects only what the chamber allows a lantern's flicker, the curve of the walls, and the feeling, yes, feeling, that something has been answered. Morella wipes her face, not in alarm, but in the manner of someone who has read a very old letter and needs a moment. Odeline nods, once the kind of nod that ends thoughts but begins tasks. Without speaking, the three of you climb. The staircase doesn't seem quite as long this time, and each footstep lands with the memory of the tone still in it. When you reach the resonance chamber, the air is different again. The jars hum quietly in agreement, and in the center of the circle stands a fourth person, Irian, of course, holding a new jar. His robes, previously muted, now shimmer faintly at the edges, as if the fabric itself had recently been reminded of purpose. It arrived, he says simply, on the step outside the archivist's door. No footprints, no courier. What's different about this one? Morella asks, already stepping forward. Irian passes it to her, carefully. It sings back. Morella's brow furrows, but she says nothing. Instead, she holds the jar in her hands, and the moment she does, a tone emerges, not a hum, but a rising melody. Not chaotic, not loud, just intentional. Notes unfolding as though rehearsed. The other jars respond first one, then another, each humming a tone that answers. A question posed, a response given. Call and reply in jars. Odeline steps back and presses her hand to the wall. The stone is warm again. The phrase is evolving. This one, Morella whispers, wasn't part of the original curve. It's an addition, a correction maybe, an annotation, Irian suggests, a footnote. You place the new jar on the pedestal, and immediately the tone from below shifts again. The floor beneath your feet vibrates, not ominously, but inquisitively, like a cascade walking across a map. You kneel and place your hand on the stone once more. This time, it doesn't just warm. It pulses. Once, twice. And then the pattern begins. A slow, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat filtered through memory. Each beat releases a soft tone that echoes through the chamber. The jars adjust their positions slightly, but enough to notice, as though realigning themselves according to some larger grammar. Morella traces the lines on the map again. The phrase is almost complete, she says. But now, it's not a statement. Then what is it, you ask? A question, she murmurs. Or maybe an invitation. Odeline lifts the silent bell. It now vibrates so subtly that it seems to shimmer in her hands without ever actually ringing. We're not the only ones who've listened, she says. Other keeps, other chambers. They've begun to echo. Irian nods. I've heard it. The tone across the hill towns. Even the oldest wells have started to murmur. So the network is waking, you say, across the whole of the land. Not just the land, Irian says. The past. You all pause, not because the word is unfamiliar, but because of the way he says it, not as metaphor, as direction. Morella sits slowly, her notebook open again. If the jars are a map and the tones a path, then we've been following a route not just across space, but through echoes of time itself. Each tone, Odeline adds, each placement replays a memory, a resonance left behind. Like footprints, you murmur, but layered. Irian reaches into his cloak and pulls out a folded parchment, an older one crisp at the edges, sealed in wax, bearing no lizard, but a spiral. Renwick left this, he says. Said it was only to be opened when the phrase changed shape. He hands it to you. You break the seal. Inside is a short passage written in that dense, precise hand you remember from the archivist's many unreadable footnotes. It reads, "When the tone begins to ask, you must decide whether to answer." The door will open again, not with force, but with memory. And memory does not lie, but it does choose which truths to sing. Below the text, a simple diagram, the resonance chamber, the pedestal, the jars arrayed in their current positions. At the center, a mark labeled simply speaker. That's here, Morella says, where the new jar rests. The chamber's about to speak, Odeline says quietly. Or maybe sing. The jars begin to pulse in sequence, now one after another, the melody growing more coherent. The vibrations travel through the floor, through your knees, up your spine, and into the air. You feel the shape of the tone before you hear it, a spiral folding inward, then opening again. And then, at last, a voice, not loud, not frightening, just a voice like wind through reeds, calm, old, and curious. It says, though not in words, you have remembered. And then, more faintly, the beginning of something else. Not a warning, not a command, but a question. You do not understand it. Not yet. But the jars hum louder. The floor warms, and the bowl below begins to ripple again. So rippling, not in panic or disruption, but in calm cadence, as though the bowl below were not holding liquid at all, but some distilled form of inquiry. You stand again in the resonance chamber, the jars now aligned in their curious semicircle, each one humming a note that harmonizes with the others in what might be described as a sentence with no punctuation but clear intent. The silent bell vibrates softly on the pedestal, not ringing, but shimmering, like a thought hovering just before words. The voice, or tone, or memory, whatever it is, still echoes in your mind. You have remembered, not an accusation, not even praise, merely a statement as factual and quiet as a candle left lit in a sealed room. Morella returns to her calculations, whispering to herself in intervals and notating resonance spikes on a strip of enchanted cloth that changes color based on the tone's consistency. Odalyn, ever methodical, rechecks each jar's position, tapping the stone beneath them with the toe of her boot, like she's trying to see if the castle itself will respond with Morse code. Irian, standing still in that way that suggests extreme listening, has his eyes closed and his hands folded inside his sleeves. The spiral is narrowing, he says softly, almost to himself. Each tone curls in toward a center we haven't found yet. The chamber below you suggest. The bowl. Deeper than that, he says, eyes opening. This is only the mouthpiece. You walk again to the stair, hidden beneath the pedestal, the one that spirals downward into that silent space where the obsidian bowl still rests waiting. You descend once more, the air cooler, now but not unpleasantly, so it smells faintly of lichen and library, like time grown slow and fragrant. When you reach the bowl, it is still rippling. And now the ripples form patterns, not random, but measured, concentric shapes that shift into spirals, then lattices, then something almost like script. It's writing, Morella whispers from behind you, having followed without a sound. No, Odalyn says from the stair above. It's singing, but in script, a visual phrase you murmur, memory rendered as shape. You all lean in slightly. The bowl's liquid begins to glow faintly, not bright, not even luminous, just gently aware of being watched. The script, or tone shape, or whatever it is, expands, unfolding like a soft sigh across the surface of the obsidian. Lines curve inward, then intersect, then form a figure, not a person, not exactly. A silhouette of motion, of gesture, a reaching hand, an invitation, Irian says now, beside you. It's asking for a reply. But how Morella says, we can't hum back, not in the same way, not with our mouths. Irian agrees, but perhaps with memory. Odeline opens her satchel. Inside are the notes you've taken since the first jar diagrams of placements, tone markings, every piece of this slow, unraveling journey. She hands you the first page, the drawing of the original resonance chamber, before the jars moved. It started here, she says, with your listening. You step forward and hold the page over the bowl. The liquid shimmers, then responds. The page is not absorbed, but acknowledged. A ripple spreads outward, then returns. The pattern in the bowl changes. A second image, Morella's map of the harmonic spiral. You lay it beside the first. More ripples, more changes. The spirals in the liquid begin to mimic the diagrams. It's listening back, you whisper. It's learning how we've understood it. Irian steps forward and places a third item, a tiny locket that had belonged to Renwick, recovered quietly from the archives. It carries no magic, just memory. The bowl responds again, the glow shifting to a soft blue, the script expanding once more. Now the figure in the liquid is clearer, not just a hand reaching out, but two, one extended, one waiting. It needs resonance, Irian says, not just sounds, shared experience, shared remembering. The jars, Morella says suddenly, we can bring them here. Let them resonate with the bowl. Odeline nods, one at a time. In sequence, you return to the resonance chamber and carry the first jar down. When you place it near the bowl, the tone of the chamber shifts again, as though the jar were clearing its throat to recite something important. The liquid shivers and emits a low tone in response, one that matches the jar. It's like conversation, you murmur, a mutual remembering. One by one, the jars are brought down, each placed carefully around the bowl's edge. With each new addition, the pattern in the liquid becomes more elaborate. Curves upon curves, tones folding into tones, colors barely perceptible, shimmering across the black surface. After the final jar is placed, the entire room hums gently, steadily, like the inside of a song, remembering its own beginning. Then the tone stops, not abruptly, not jarringly, just completes. A silence follows, not empty, but full, expectant. You wait. And then the liquid in the bowl rises, not much, only an inch, and the shape within shifts. From the figure of a hand to something else, a door, round, outlined in tone. It does not open, not yet, but it pulses once in time with your heartbeat, and in the silence that follows, the castle listens. The castle listens, and so do you, all of you, standing in the silent circle around the bowl, where the liquid has now steadied into a shape no longer spiraling, but distinctly, undeniably a door. It does not open, nor does it seem, in any particular hurry, to as though it understands that rushing would be rather impolite. The jars remain around the pedestal like attentive pupils. Their hums momentarily ceased, as if they too are waiting for a cue. Morella leans forward slightly, sketching the image in the bowl with a stick of charcoal that squeaks faintly against the page. It's not a door made of stone, she says, or wood. It's tonal. A harmonic seal, Irian adds, nodding once as though confirming a long-held suspicion. The entrance doesn't unlock with keys. It resonates with pattern. So it's waiting for the right sound, Odeline says, or sequence of sounds, you murmur. Watching as faint notations begin to ripple across the liquid again, forming a brief cluster of dots and curved lines, like a piece of music trying to remember its chorus. You retrieve the silent bell, still faintly vibrating in its hushed way, and step toward the bowl. It feels oddly light in your hands now, as though its weight had been absorbed into purpose. You place it gently near the bowl's edge, and the response is immediate. A tremble, a faint pulse. And then the bowl emits a tone that matches the bell's frequency. Not loud, not bright, but true. The outline of the door shivers and becomes clearer, more defined. Not a flat symbol, but something layered like a sound stretched across time. It needs more, Morella says. Something cumulative. Not just one mote, but something remembered in motion. Irian produces from his sleeve an object none of you had seen before, a small circular instrument shaped like a flattened compass. He calls it the echo loom, a device once used to store moments of harmonic alignment, though the process for reading them had been mostly forgotten since the previous century and relegated to page 84 of an unsorted appendix. We need to walk the phrase, he says. Let the jars speak again, in sequence, not as individual notes, but as one fluid memory. You nod and step back, watching as he sets the echo loom down beside the first jar. Morella adjusts the distance between the jars, with minute, almost ceremonial precision, ensuring the arc is tight but unbroken. Then Irian activates the device. The tone begins a soft hum, then another, then another. The jars respond, each one contributing a note to a melody not designed for ears, but for stone and silence, and whatever lies behind that not quite open door. The tone flows in a circle, clockwise humming from jar to jar, and with each pass, the door's shape in the bowl shifts, first gaining texture, then depth, then something like movement, though it does not open. It leans forward in the liquid as though curious. The tone continues now, forming a progression, notes repeating, but not identically. They evolve slightly subtly, like a memory being remembered differently each time it's spoken aloud. The silent bell rings once, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, and in that moment, the bowl flashes with a shimmer that rises to the walls, projecting soft lines of glowing symbols across the chamber. Marella gasps. Those are the old glyphs, the ones from before the archivist calendar. Odeline traces one with her finger in the air. They're all verbs, actions, but ambiguous. Not commands, you say. Possibilities. The jars hum louder, and the tone reaches a peak, not volume, but clarity. Then silence. Again, not emptiness, anticipation. The bowl now shows not just the door, but what lies beyond it. At least part of it. A corridor circular, lined with more jars, but not like yours. These are taller, narrower, etched with runes, too complex to have been decorative. They vibrate gently, visible in the projection, though still unreachable. Marella sketches furiously. They're storing larger things, she says. Not just memories, narratives, or songs, or warnings, Irian adds quietly. That's always an option. Do we open it? Odeline asks. We're very near that part of the story. You look to the jars, to the bowl, to the echo now settling through the chamber, like the last breath of a lullaby. The bowl's liquid begins to move again. Only this time, it doesn't ripple, it spins, slowly, inward, creating a vortex that doesn't sink, but expands across the surface in concentric rings of resonance. If we're to answer the tone, Irian says, we must let it finish its question. You think it's still asking, you ask. I think it always has been, he replies. And then, very softly, from somewhere beyond the bowl, perhaps within the unseen corridor, comes a tone none of you placed. none of you expected. It is higher, slower, and it does not wait for your reply. It sings, not words, not instruction, a greeting, an echo that has waited years, centuries, perhaps longer, for someone to listen long enough to be heard, and someone to listen long enough to be heard. And now the chamber answers with a hush more profound than silence, the kind that gathers not because there is nothing to say, but because everything is being said at once, just in ways too ancient to name. You watch as the vortex in the bowl slows the final ring of liquid light, expanding gently outward, settling again into stillness. The projected door fades from the surface, and in its place there now lies a shimmer of transparency, an image, a threshold not made of wood or metal, but memory rendered visible. You rise, and the others follow, and without a spoken plan, all of you step closer to the bowl, waiting for the door to do what doors are made for. But it does not open. Instead, the resonance in the room shifts again, gently, pulling backward, as if reeling in something previously sent out. The jars hum together once more, but this time the melody is reversed, like a song played backward by a remembering world. Then the wall behind the pedestal sighs, not cracks, not shifts, but exhales, and from it unfolds a passage hidden until now, lined with stone so smooth it might have been polished by thought. No hinges, no dust, just presence. I think that's our invitation, Morella says, voice just above a whisper. Do we go in? Odelan asks, already halfway there. Irian steps forward, his expression unreadable, except for a faint look of relief. We walk it, he says, like a line in a song, from note to note. You take a lantern, though it hardly seems necessary. The corridor itself glows faintly lit, not by flame or spell, but by the memory of light. The walls hum gently, and the floor beneath your steps doesn't echo, but seems to carry your movement forward, a steady pull without pressure. As you walk, the hum around you deepens, broadens, until it becomes something akin to a feeling pressed gently against your ribs. The passage curves slightly always to the left, a spiral that draws you inward. Along the walls, shallow alcoves appear, each one holding a jar taller than the last, marked with unfamiliar glyphs, and sealed in wax that shimmers blue, then green, then colors you only recognize from dreams. Morella pauses at one alcove. These weren't placed like ours, she says. These were grown, or called, Irian adds, born from resonance itself. You reach out toward one and pause, not because of fear, but because touching something that hums like time might be rude without permission. The jar vibrates slightly, acknowledging your presence, then returns to stillness. These aren't memories, Odelon says. They're possibilities. Ahead, the corridor expands into a larger chamber. Circular, of course, because everything truly ancient favors spirals over angles, and at its center is not a bowl, but a platform raised slightly and carved with concentric circles that spin ever so slowly beneath your feet as you step onto it. The room begins to resonate, not loudly, not even audibly at first, but with that deep inner tone that makes your teeth remember vibrations they've never known. Around the chamber's edge, more jars. But now they begin to sing. One by one, in sequence, then overlapping their tones, creating a chord so vast and gentle that it folds around your thoughts like a quilt woven from sound and patience. The air grows warmer, not with heat, but with understanding. And then, without warning, and yet not surprisingly, the platform tilts slightly forward. Not enough to unbalance you, but enough to suggest movement. And then, beneath your feet, a second tone begins to rise, not from the jars, not from the walls, but from beneath the platform itself. It rises slowly, curling around the other, sounds weaving through them, shaping them until they become something more, a phrase. Not in any language you know, not in any tongue ever taught, but in tone, in pace, in rhythm. The platform completes a single rotation. Then it stops. A final tone, deep and resonant, echoes once through the chamber and fades. And then, in the stillness that follows, you understand. Not everything, but enough. The jars were never the story. They were the syntax, the grammar of memory. The chamber, the corridor, this platform, they are the sentence. And you are now inside the punctuation mark that comes before the question. Irian steps beside you, his eyes shining faintly. It is asking, he says. Now, finally, it asks. What is the question, you whisper? He gestures toward the jars, now humming softly, not insistently. It wants to know if we remember what we've forgotten. Do we? Morella asks. We might, Odeline says, or we might have to choose what's worth remembering. The platform pulses beneath your feet, not a tremor, a heartbeat. And then slowly, a sound begins again, not from outside, but from you. A single hum rising without effort, as though something inside you had always known this note, this pitch, and had only now been given permission to sing it. The jars answer, the corridor sings, and the tone, once a whisper, becomes a path. Becomes a path winding not just through the air, but through you, as though the tone were unspooling from a place far older than your bones, older than the stone beneath the castle, older even than the jars now humming in tandem, like a choir of very polite ancestors. The note that begins inside you does not belong to your voice, not exactly, but neither is it foreign. It is something remembered in your breath, not your thoughts, a sound that had waited quietly through all your silences for this precise moment to step forward. And as you hum, or perhaps as the note hums through you, the resonance chamber responds with a stillness so complete it could only be described as attentive. The platform beneath your feet begins to rotate again, this time more slowly, not spinning, but drifting, like the surface of a pond, catching the shape of the wind. Irian stands at your side, eyes closed, his hands open and relaxed, as if ready to catch a falling idea. Morella traces the lines carved into the walls of the chamber with one finger, her expression soft with recognition, not of the symbols, but of the feeling they carry. Odeline is humming too, now her tone lower than yours, a harmony so subtle it feels like the space between words in an old lullaby. Around you, the jars hum back. But this time, they are not responding, they are following. For the first time, the tone leads, and it leads downward. Not deeper into the chamber, but into the resonance itself, into the very layers of meaning stored in each vibration. The floor does not open, nor does the wall crack, but something more profound shifts your awareness of space, of where you are, and what you are inside begins to stretch. You are not just standing in a chamber of tone. You are standing in a sentence that bends through time, and you are the verb. The note rises, slowly, carefully. Each breath you take is part of it now. The sound becomes richer, more textured. It collects the harmony from the jars, the whisper from the bowl, the echo from the corridor, and binds them together with the silence that once held them apart. As the tone climbs, the platform warms not uncomfortably, but like stone at noon after a long morning of sunlight. The chamber breathes, the platform exhales, and at the peak of the tone, when the hum becomes so clear, it borders on stillness. The chamber answers with something new, a memory. It is not shown, not projected, not even spoken. It is placed gently inside your awareness, like a folded map placed in your palm. You see, or rather, you feel a tower, long since vanished, standing alone in a windless field, its walls lined not with books or shelves or symbols, but with sounds, stored in long glass-like tubes, humming just faintly enough to remind the wind how to move. At the top of this tower stands a figure yourself, or someone much like you, or someone who has carried your tone before. They are holding a jar, not to store it, but to give it away. The memory folds inward. The tone drops gently now, easing back into its hum. The platform slows, and the jars are quiet. For a long moment, there is no sound in the chamber, no hum, no voice. Just the subtle shift of awareness settling into place, like dust choosing where to land after a long and careful fall. Morella speaks first. It remembered us. Irian nods. And it wanted to be remembered. Was that the question Odalina asks? It wasn't one you say softly. It was a gesture, a reaching out. The platform comes to a stop. The center glows faintly again, the shape of the original spiral, now visible in the stone. The chamber seems unchanged, yet nothing is quite the same. You step down. The jars are still. The corridor behind you hums faintly, like a hallway humming itself to sleep. Is it finished? Morella asks. You shake your head. Not finished. Begun. The memory still rests in you, not heavy, not burdensome, just present, a tone that has chosen to stay. The castle walls no longer vibrate, but the silence now carries music, the kind you can only hear when you've listened long enough to remember what you forgot you knew.